Okay, Lammy, we're going to talk about board games. We don't have a specific one in mind. We talked about Inscryption last time, which was really interesting. And I'm really glad that you introduced me to that game. Board games have been around for me, well, yeah, longer than video games and are really important to me, whether it's the simple board games, even going to card games like Hearts or Duroc or something like that, even Bridge, which I've learned to play a little bit with my grandmother. Really enjoyable game, partly because of the social aspect, which we talk about often in these conversations of rubber ducking about the social aspect of gaming, which sometimes is foreign to me, but certainly not when it comes to board games. In fact, if there's no social element to a board game, I really don't know why I would play it. Some games on boardgamearena.com I've played by myself a little bit, but and it can be a hook with the mechanics, but it's just not the same thing, right? It's just not the same thing as being in a room with other people. But I wanted to talk about board games from various different angles, in part to talk about the similarities with video games and also the differences with video games, and how, as a designer, are you thinking about the same principles, or are the principles quite a bit different? How close are the two circles on the Venn diagram, so to speak? And where is the middle area? But for you, when we talk about video games, what gets you excited about them? What gets you interested and hungry to play again with board games?
With board games.
Did I say video
With
games or did I say board games?
you said video games and then you said board games.
Correction.
With board games, definitely I think it's the social aspect. Um, and also, to be honest, it's a little bit of that, oh, I have a new toy and I want to play with it. So I think, unlike a lot of other pieces of tech, which are my preferred way to spend my money, but it's a way to acquire like a new toy, a new thing, a new object to play with that you actually don't get to play very deeply with very often. Some other things. So because often board games have a certain time commitment, organizing your friends to get together, I find that there are games, especially bigger ones, talk about that you don't really get to experience very many times. And so I think one of the things that keeps me wanting to do it is that, like, oh, I get to play with this thing I just haven't had a chance to get bored of yet, let's say. So there's a bit of that unlike other games that I could just boot up at any point and just play, even if they're multiplayer, if they're online, there's sort of a world there waiting for me, and I just get to choose when I log in. Because it's something that has to be set up with other people and maybe has a well requirement, it keeps me kind of hungry and not bored of it. I have to play a board game quite a lot in a short period to really feel like I've dug deep enough, experienced all that there is.
Yeah, I would relate to that, but also for video games. So I've got games on my computer in my Steam account that I've never played, that I want to, but only want to play when I'm ready to give it the time. So the Dragon Age series is a good example of this, where Dragon Age Origins, Dragon Age Inquisition, and I think they're coming out with a new Dragon Age game. Um, I don't want to play those games until I'm ready to devote some time, and not just an hour a day or an hour a week or something like that. I want to sink into the story and see how those games were made. There's other games as well that are on my shelf, so to speak. But the same is true with board games. My wife and I, when we got married, we asked as wedding gifts to get board games, and so we got a ton of them that we asked for. But a bunch of them we've now played. The ones we've never played are, partly because it's my wife and she's not interested in playing with me, Axis and Allies, different versions of this game. For example, there's an Axis and Allies Zombies game, which I have no idea how it works. I've never set it up. And honestly, these games are such that I could spend 3 hours one evening just setting it up and reading the rules. And I probably wouldn't feel like the evening was wasted. Maybe I would. Anyways, we talked about Axis and Allies before. What I know that you've never played, right? You've never played Axis and Allies, but you've heard of it from Artie and maybe some other people, right?
Yeah, I think you and Artie might be the only people I've heard bring it up, and maybe anybody that he would have been speaking to about it. But I'm again not surprised at all that you're mentioning this game. You guys have a huge overlap in the kind of video games, board games.
Yeah, and I think I mentioned this before in our previous conversations because I said we have to talk about Axis and Allies. So let's just get it out of the way. It's the thing that neither of us share in, so let's just talk about it right at the beginning. Um, what makes it interesting to me is a microcosm of what makes other games interesting when it comes to board games. This social dynamic. But it's social in a way that other people don't expect. When I describe playing Axis and Allies to people, and I have had my wife play with other people, I've invited them over. It's like 6 hours long, or maybe even more sometimes. You sit around a table, around a map, and one person's turn can take, half an hour as they go into a room and they talk with their team about what they're going to do, and they come back and they move their pieces into position. That's like 15 minutes before they actually start rolling. And so if there's 5 people, the other 4 people, allies or not, are talking amongst themselves, whether it's trash talking the person who's going, or talking about the theme of the game, war, or once that's been exhausted, talking about 100 different other things. And you almost have to, because the discomfort of just sitting there for so long, when you really have nothing to do, you could analyze the board all you want, is so great that you just have to have this social dynamic. And I've played it, I think, half a dozen times or so. And every time I play it, I discover the same thing, that it almost forces us to have conversations we might not normally have. I find that when we're playing cards, it's almost too much to focus on if you want to be good. And so once you get in the rhythm, there's almost no conversation. Snippets here and there, but anyone can shut it down at any time because they need to focus. Or if they do that, they might get made fun of, but there's a break to the conversation. Whereas in Axis and Allies, one person is focusing in and no one else is really part of it. Now, I can understand how that might sound like a terrible game, and it may be, but it's interesting how it creates this other energy in the room. And I'm wondering if there's other games that do that successfully as well, and how to meet this balance between getting people into a room together and chatting with each other and having a conversation they wouldn't normally have if they were just sitting there, but also having an engaging, dynamic, interesting, provocative, and fun experience together. Yeah, what do you think?
I do think that can actually happen, does happen with card games as well, especially ones that are easy to make decisions in. Like you can make a quick decision about something so that you can almost do it automatically, right? There's tons of these card games where it's not really about the game. Like the game exists and, people are winning rounds or losing rounds, but it's more about the conversation that's happening on top of them. And I think you're right. If it's a very competitive game or highly deeply strategic, or it also depends on the group and how seriously they might be taking it, then you might not have such a deep conversation. But I think, with games like Whist and Hearts and things like that, you could definitely still have those table conversations you're talking about. And the I think simpler in a way the decision making is in a game, and yet is still interesting, has that deep strategy, even if the choice you're making at any point is actually a simple one, is a good way to make it an automatic sort of thing you're doing, and it just also helps the conversation go. So I think card games are good for that. I think it gets harder when it's a deeper strategy game. So it's interesting that you're saying that in Axis Allies you're feeling like you have that space. But I guess it depends on whether it's important that the other players pay attention to what the one person is doing on their turn or not.
I mean, it is important that you pay attention, but it just takes so long. And I think that that might sound like a flaw, but it's 2 things. There's the complexity of the game that we all have to understand, but also every time I've played, I've never played with people, all of whom have played before. So there's always a sense of learning the game. And every single turn, someone's like, wait, this moves 2 squares again, or 2 movement pieces, or how does this one attack, or what special abilities do I have, or whatever. There's always these questions of how to play the game, which would slow things down. So maybe my experience is tainted by this beginner syndrome. And if I were playing with people who had played many times before, the speed of it would probably create a very different experience. But there's also a sense of there's only so much I can learn as a first-time player in Axis and Allies playing or watching someone else's turn. Okay, I get it. Those ones move like this. Okay, I think I understand. Okay, moving on to something else. I'll have a different conversation until it's my turn. Oh, he's going to attack me over there. I better attack over there or something. And there really is wonderful strategy to this game, and it's the only game I've ever played where the last time was actually here in Whitehorse. I got 4 other people to come over, and we played all together. And at one point, 3 people had to go off into another room so that they could strategize and the other 2 people could strategize. And we really did have a proper 5 to 10 minute war gaming session of how do we defeat the other guys? What's our strategy? What are we telling them is our strategy? And it's still fun, and you're making fun of each other, and it's not a big deal, but it is a big deal. And, there's such an interesting dynamic. There's one more thing I'll say about Axis and Allies, though, is that, and I would imagine that any game designer would say this is not a well-designed game. Maybe not as bad as Monopoly, but the conclusion of this game is predetermined within the first few turns. There's this flurry of action at the beginning of the game where the Axis, Germany and Japan, have to do a lot in their first few turns to secure victory. Because they have all the power at the beginning, but if they wait too long, the Allies, like in history, will build up their economic power and just be unstoppable. And it doesn't matter after 10 turns if they haven't gained enough ground and gained enough economic power. The Axis, it's a ticking time bomb. It's only a matter of time before they're defeated. So there's also a sense that there's a slight advantage for the Allies at the beginning of the game. Also be mindful, I'm talking about the original Axis and Allies. The only one I've ever played from 1984. So the newer versions have corrected this, I think. But there is this interesting kind of onus on the Axis powers we've really got to try hard in the first couple of turns. We have to take risks. We have to be adventurous and hope the other guys make a mistake. And in spite of all of that, there's a feeling of we have to really strategize this and work together and fake out the enemy. And maybe it's my lack of having played that many games, but I've never had a similar experience before, and it's repeated every time I've played. And that has to be something I credit to this American-style board game, Axis and Allies.
Have you ever played Diplomacy?
I have it, never played it, because I've looked at the rules and gone, oh, this is an Axis and Allies 7-hour game. I should wait until I'm ready for this. No, have you?
I haven't. It's another one I kind of refuse to play because I'm pretty sure I will hate every minute. But it is another game Artemis absolutely adores, and it literally is purely the human interaction with strategy and, screwing people over, making alliances. That's what the game is. And I think you might find that really fun. I struggle having a good time in a game with my friends where, their goal is actually to destroy me. and to do it in a subvertive, manipulative, lying sort of way. I am one of those people. I actually took a few years off of playing board games when I realized that I was a really poor sport and I wasn't enjoying myself. Not only was I a poor sport for people I was playing with, but I was I'm not enjoying this. I get upset. I have a huge justice complex. So I would feel so maligned anytime that, everybody would gang up. It's everyone against everyone. But the best strategy in most of these games is to slowly pick off people one at a time. The best thing you can usually do in a lot of these games from the way they're designed is for everyone to essentially ally and take people out one at a time. This is not fun. This is just, there's no way, usually, if you are, the solitary person that they've just decided is the next one to be kicked out of the game. And that would literally bugged me so much that I just said, I need to not play board games for a few years. And I did that, and I grew and I matured as a person, and I can play board games again. I am no longer a poor sport. I think I've reformed. I did a lot of growing up from being a high school kid and just not enjoying myself, really, is what it was. But I still think, and now I really look at games and the way they're designed, that there's a problem with these games that don't solve this issue and also make it such that a person, once they're out or once they're too far behind, at that point they might as well not be playing. Like, even if there is play in the game, if there's no chance for them to affect the game in any way, or anything, any way that their decisions matter, why are they playing? And to me, that is one of the biggest missteps, because as we've said, for video games and board games, what's a really important part of it, and that's that player choice matters, or at least they feel like it matters, but hopefully it does truly matter, because if they can figure out that it doesn't, it's no longer interesting. And when you get to a point where it doesn't matter what you do, right, either chance or other players take away and completely take away, as in you can't react to it in any way, that feels really, really bad. And it gets worse when there's no way back into the game or any way to interact with the game after the fact. And I do think games have gotten better at addressing this as they've been developed.
Absolutely. Before we get into this conversation about how games have changed, kind of what we're talking about right now is the difference between European style games and American style games. European style games emerging in the 70s and 80s, essentially German style games, really, or Euro games. And one of the big differences is in most Euro games, there's no player elimination. So Settlers of Catan is like, the quintessential Euro game. Released in 1995, and it evangelized European style games around the world. You might shake your head at that, but if it weren't for Settlers of Catan, you might not be playing all these other games, and you might be saying, okay, after my 2-year hiatus of board games, I'm back. Okay, welcome back to Axis and Allies and Risk. Hope you have a good time.
Okay, just on that note, Settlers of Catan is the reason I stopped playing board games.
Really? Okay. So
we should talk about that, because I actually think it's one of the worst at kicking people essentially out of the game.
But were you kicked out, or were you just so far behind you couldn't come back?
That's what I mean. But also that you can't do anything. That you, when you play the game, you are so locked in by what the other players have done that you can't take actions, which is the same as being kicked out. You might not be actually kicked out, but it's almost worse. You're like forced to participate. I can't even go be, and I'm like, but it doesn't matter. It makes me be like, I just, what's the point? I have no good options. Anyway, Settlers, I do not think is a well-designed game, but I agree, and I credit it as being a very influential game that got us to where we are today in board.
Well, I certainly don't want to dig up bones from this closet and have you reach through half the continent to kill me. So I'm not going to do that. But what I will say is, in many games of Settlers that I've played, the person who's in behind, who seems like they're locked in, they can't do anything, they're totally screwed, sometimes turns to a different strategy, such as collecting development cards, and have come out on top. It doesn't usually happen, make no mistake, but it can happen. And I think that's part of the excitement of the game. And I thought you were talking about Risk. And in a game like Risk, especially classic Risk, there's a sense of you will be gone and eliminated. People will take your cards and you have to go do something else. Play a card game, have a meal, or enjoy your life while these two idiots roll dice for 9 hours more in this silly back and forth. Because I love Risk. It has many memories for me in childhood, but I think part of the poor design of that game is that once you get into the end game, as it were, it's just a chore, because there are so many armies on the board, because it has this growth of strength that if you turn 3 cards into the beginning, it's only worth 5 armies, but you turn 3 cards in the end game, it could give you 30 armies. With 30 armies, you could eliminate a player, but you might not be able to win. And the next turn, the next guy gets 35 armies. And it just becomes this insane amount of dice rolling, which is addictive in a way that a video game can be addictive in a bad way, where you're just pushing the rock up the hill for no good reason. And a European style game usually corrects that by having a set time limit, by saying this is going to take about 60 minutes. And there's a mechanic that's going to almost force that. So in Settlers of Catan, you've got to get 10 points. And someone's going to get 10 points because the game is just going to escalate too quickly. Or other mechanics other than a timer, a literal timer. Although I'm sure some games actually have that. And I think that and just to go back to Risk for one more second, there's something about the theme of that game, which American-style games seem to, as opposed to European games, do very well, which is to rope you into the theme and to make you feel like you're actually conquering the world. We all know those, late night games we're playing and someone's conquering the world. There really is that sense of ego behind it. And that has corrected the poor mechanics. Monopoly is actually quite similar. People have argued, why is Monopoly so popular? It's actually not well designed. For once, in the same way as Axis and Allies, in the first few turns, it's kind of preordained who's going to win. And there's very little the other players can do about it. Luck has almost run out for them. And yet we love it in part because of the role play. Isn't it fun to be the kind of person who could collect properties and charge rent? And it was originally intended to be a critique of capitalism, but became almost an actualization of capitalism on a board where you can play the Monopoly man. Anyways, I'm going off about all these games, but I didn't realize it was Settlers that pushed you away from gaming, because for a lot of people, that's what brought them in. But I can totally see, because I've seen some raw emotions at the table. How do you balance that? How do you make sure that a game is not too real or too visceral? And Risk would do the same. I've seen people get really hurt feelings over Risk as well. How do you balance that sense of fun and competition and the need for a little bit of fire? It's good to have some emotion at play. It's good, when I exercise and play sports with people, I like feeling angry at them for winning, because that's part of almost me getting that out. So yeah, how do you think we should balance this when we play, but also maybe when we design these things?
I think for me, the reason I brought up that, and diplomacy specifically, and that feeling of your friends sort of backstabbing you, lying to your face, is I think that that's really more my issue rather than just a straight competition. For example, I like chess, and I do like a lot of 2-player games. It's just me against somebody else. That doesn't feel as hurtful because it is the premise of the game that we are playing each other in some way. I think where I really start to feel like it's not fun is, like I said, in a group setting, when the game is designed in such a way that inadvertently the best strategy eventually becomes picking on someone. It's, for example, let's go back to talking about Dungeons and Dragons for a little bit. The dungeon masters have a choice of attacking the same person every turn until they're dead. And that will be the best strategy. And yet, dungeon masters will choose to dole out the damage and try to spread it evenly, and will purposefully not try to attack the person necessarily that is really low health, depending on the situation, because they're not trying to wipe the party. And when I play board games, even when it's a competitive board game against a group of people, I often will do that, where I will feel bad. I have a moralistic feeling, and I'm in this room playing with friends, trying to have a fun time, and I don't want to sit there ganging up on the person who's already doing the worst and everybody else is attacking. I will purposefully make choices like attacking somebody different. I'm like, because the point is to have fun, right? The point is to play the game. If you just beat somebody down until they're out and then focus on the next person, you're essentially saying whoever's already kind of winning is deciding who gets to play the game or not. Like, that's not, I don't know, that's not fun. And I think it feels worse when it's one person against many. I think it's a different, again, when it's even, when it's you against one other person, it's even. You are both attacking each other, and there's a sort of fairness. And again, this is why I say the justice complex always came in. But at the end, I'm like, that just isn't fun. And I think that there is a failure and a flaw in the design of the game, because if that ends up being the best strategy, then I think that makes for an unfun time. And that, like, you can actually create scenarios where that isn't the case. To bring up Magic the Gathering again, that we've talked about before, it was actually one of the things I didn't like about playing group games in Magic the Gathering either, because you can actually play as groups. And again, often the best strategy, like always, is just pick one player at a time, and everybody gangs up, attacks only that one player until they're out. So they've developed versions where you actually can't do that, like Two-Headed Dragon, where each person is only allowed to attack the two people in front of them. They're not allowed to attack anybody else until people are out, and now there's a different two people in front of them. And, there have to be tactics. Otherwise, it's just too it becomes just a very unfun time for whoever happens to either be worst at the game or had the worst luck or whatever it might be. And that isn't the point. I think that isn't the point. We're all there meeting to have a fun, good time. And so whenever it's group games, I do really like, to continue that fire, I like co-op games. You can still get the same difficulty, the same feeling of strategy, but it's no longer you against your friends or your family. You are now coming together to defeat some greater goal. And I think you can have still that same feeling and fire. And I still do play those other kinds of games. And I just have to, I have to do the thing of reminding myself, like, I'll just judge these people worse later because they're not as cool as me. They don't try to make sure that everyone's having a good time. I'm sitting out here making sure everyone's having a good time. They just want to win. Clearly, I'm the better person. No, but I try to care less, right? As a person who is competitive, and I like strategy games and all that, but I also want, like, the goal for me, the number one goal is to be playing. That's why we're there. And so if people don't get a chance to play, which comes back to making choices, what does that mean? That the player gets to make a choice that then has an outcome to the game. And this could show up in different ways. I have seen games that address this where if you get knocked out, you either have opportunities to come back in or your version of the game changes. So I've seen, like, sort of ghost versions. It comes up in video games as well. You have Among Us, where even if you're killed in the game, you are now a ghost who can still perform actions. And maybe the actions are a bit less impactful, or maybe there's, you can get back into the game or all that. It might not be quite as fun, but it's something. It's something to feel like you're not immediately just out. And yes, you're right. Risk, right up there with games I used to not have a very good time with before Settlers. But it took me a while of playing Settlers of Catan to realize that it ended up making me. It wasn't immediate. It was only after I realized that even though a person isn't kicked out, if everyone else does choose to try to stop one person, the reality ends up being the same. Like I said, even if I'm playing, but if the choices I'm making don't matter, it's at the point where I realize the choices I'm making don't matter that I go, why am I doing it?
Yeah, you're totally making sense. And honestly, everything in what you just said is a explanation as to why we should have these conversations, and why we should have them like we're having them. I want to change your mind on some things sometimes, but I'm also open to be changed and be moved and have my position changed. And when you talk about this, I go, yeah, you're kind of right. Like, many times when I played Settlers, often with, my male cousins or other friends who are male, there's this sense of competition. And let's have fun knocking someone out. And of course, in the context of a single game of Settlers of Catan, that's no fun for one person. But taken in the context of 50 games, played maybe even sequentially in a row, or 10 games or whatever, you play over and over, everyone's going to be in that seat. And everyone's going to be at some point in the top seat. And everyone's going to be feeling like crap. And everyone's going to at some point be feeling like they're on top. It's going to happen for everybody. And so we all get to share almost in that role play of being top dog or being the person that's just being trapped. And sometimes you can always think to yourself, maybe this is the time that I'll come back from behind. And isn't that the most possible fun you can have, is when you were counted out and then come back and win the thing. Like, that is glorious in cards, in board games. And so when you say it's no fun, you're totally right. And I'm not taking that away. But sometimes the no fun that you're having is the fun that the rest of us are having. And that's not a good thing necessarily. But again, if you take it over the course of a longer term, it could be fun for everybody. And you mentioned Dungeons and Dragons. This is a really good point. As a DM, when I'm doing combat encounters, I certainly want to make people feel like their choices matter. Absolutely. I also want to make them feel like I'm not picking on anybody, but I sometimes want to make them feel like I am picking on a character. There are some combat encounters which are about one character more than the others. There are some combat encounters in Dungeons and Dragons where your enemy is smart enough to know that they should eliminate this guy first. That the wizard's got to go down right away before they can cast this number of spells or whatever. And as a dungeon master, you kind of have to accept that at a certain point, the players are advanced and experienced enough at like level 15 or something, that these are the consequences. And again, if you're mirroring as much as you can a realistic interpretation of the scenario, these lives are on the line. We've talked about Dungeons and Dragons and death before, and I don't want to necessarily revisit that, but I do remember in the campaign that I ran for you and the other guys that there were moments when I did single out particular characters and I wanted that to be part of the plot. And if I ever found out that they felt like they were being picked on because of them as a player, then I would feel horrified, because that wasn't my intention. And I know that other DMs are try to be really careful about this, but you're also following instinct. There's a lot going on as a dungeon master. There's a lot of information coming, and when it comes to when it's your turn as the DM in a combat encounter, and you've got like 17 different things to think about, sometimes the easiest path is the right one. And if that's picking on Lammy because she's almost dead anyways, and it's always so fun to pick on her, then that's what we're gonna. No, I'm just joking. But it is so interesting, and I think that again, many Euro games try to correct this and not necessarily try to balance it out. Someone is almost always going to win the game. But a game like Agricola, which is a farming simulator, you can play by yourself. You can have a one-person game of Agricola. You can play against another person, but pretty much you're doing your own thing on your own little board, which then might make people feel like that the power of luck in a game is to make a guy who, the beginner's luck, classically, someone who's never played before, able to win. But there's that conversation between skill and luck, and Euro games usually diminish the role of luck, not to zero, but diminish it, and put a little bit more onus on skill, experience, knowledge of the game, and so forth, which can alienate some people, especially if they've never played before. Someone said recently that the modern board gamer's experience and knowledge of board games is greater than pretty much any board game designer would have had in the 1970s. Right? That's how far we've come. Similar to film, like the modern film goer's appreciation of cinema is more advanced than a filmmaker would have been in the 1920s and 30s. We have so much shorthand and so much knowledge of what films do, and how a wink from the camera can communicate what 10 minutes of dialogue would have had to communicate, 80 years ago. Anyways, I'm going off, but I think there's a lot of fertile ground here for talking about the most important thing with games, which is the player experience. Back to you. Strike me down.
I guess the question, though, is, again, what is the goal of playing board games? And this is where I fall, because for me, the goal is to have fun and have a social night with friends. And it's not to win, although I like winning, don't get me wrong. And I'm very competitive. And I type A, teacher's pet. I always wanted to be the best and do the best. But my number one goal was still, at the end of the day, like, I wasn't, I didn't need to invite all my friends over just so I could beat them at a game. Like, that wasn't, my goal was to have a social and nice time. And I think in those social dynamics, I just want the night, like, I want the game to keep going and to be fun. Like, that's what it's interesting. I want to keep experiencing it. We've talked before about how I'm very motivated by, like, exploration in a way. And I wanted to bring up that exploration doesn't really exist in board games, right? It's more like a puzzle game. Like, if you would do a crossword, or, it's more of a puzzle. Like, you're trying to work something out. There's a strategy and you're thinking through, but you're not exploring. I'm not getting that itch scratched in the way that I do with video games, in terms of, like, seeing new environments or experiencing a new part of the story. There are some that try to do that, like kind of story games or co-op games, but I actually don't get that out of them. What I do get out of them is what we've discussed before, which is that tickling the part of your brain that is making new connections, and which is the strategy part, right? And trying to be efficient. It really gets me in that efficiency. How can I make the best move and the best turn possible? And the best turn possible within the confines of the game systems, which is why I find that idea, the meta of picking on one person, like, might be the clear best way to play, but that's not the game. That's just gaming, right? That's not what the best way to play a turn in that game. It's just a good strategy in general. And so games where that is inherent to the game, like diplomacy, like Axis and Allies, where in fact part of the game is specifically lying and picking on people, are even harder for me in a way, because it's like, why would I play the exact thing I don't like about these other games? And so I guess it's, I would imagine, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I would imagine that for players that really enjoy those games, you are enjoying interacting with that aspect of your brain and of other people. That, there's that, you talked about how fun it is to do the strategizing and to do all that and to think about it. And I get that. I think that I just want to have fun more, if that makes sense. Like in just sense of the pure enjoyment of a social night, I feel like there are times where I want to very much challenge my strategic brain, in a way. And I get that out more in a one-on-one game where I realize that everyone there, everyone at that event, because it's not just me. I've noticed situations, right, where with board gaming, you get situations where people are coming to this evening with different preconceived notions of what kind of fun they're going to have. And I want to make sure when it's a group of people that we're all having fun and all feeling engaged, because I don't know if you've experienced this, but usually there's a few people at the board game night that aren't as into board games as everyone else, right? Like there's the experience and you can feel it and they're kind of bored and they're kind of, and that's not fun. In the end, that's not why you want to be there. I want everyone to have a good time. I want to have a good time. And if my goal is to be really, really like get into that brain space, you need a very specific group of people to make that happen, work. And you all need to come in, I think, knowing that that's what you're getting. And I think that, probably you and your male cousins could have that. You were all coming in and feeling that, and you had a built up history of that happening. But as adults playing board games, the reality is that it's often just, hey, let's get together, hang out. People have different interests. There's almost always at any board game night, you don't have, like, I don't think I've ever had it where everyone had played the game we were playing, ever. It didn't matter what the game was, except for the times when I used to play a lot of Settlers of Catan back in the day. And that's when the bad feelings started happening more so, right? Because you had now metas and you had people who were consistently winning almost every time you played. There were people that were consistently the better players, and there were, dynamics that were developing, people who played differently than others, people who were always underhanded, people who were, and you started to know that. The same probably as you would in like poker or other strategy games where people's behavior would start to read them. It's both more fun because you can track it over time, but it also can create, issues, that it brings out the flaws in games the more you play. Notice the issues with them. So I think it's goal. Like for me, goal is to have fun. And if the goal is to scratch the itch of thinking really hard, I might choose a 2-player game or a puzzle or some sort of single-player puzzle.
Yeah, I wonder if it's a feature of games, probably not often thought about by designers, of how to incorporate the fact that usually there's at least one beginner at the table, right? Like that is such a common trope in board gaming, that there's someone who's never played before and we're guiding them through, and that's part of the joy of it. And maybe what makes a good game often is the one that allows that person who's playing for the first time to still win. But does that become a shield against complexity? There are a lot of complex board games out there. I played one relatively recently called Terraforming Mars, and I was amazed at how much was happening on the board, how many different mechanics were occurring, how big my hand of cards was, and there were other things that I had to think about. And I really didn't have a lot of time for conversation, but I also didn't have time to be casual, or I would lose. Right? There's a sense of a lot of games where you might be casual the entire time and be eating or chatting with somebody and not really care about the outcome. But there's other times when when it comes to be your turn, you're a bit more casual, but next time you're going to really play because you're talking to someone about something. That is usually factored into a lot of these games. And I think sometimes a more complicated game misses that in the hope of becoming almost an addictive game for a group of people who play all the time, become masters of this game. And then I wonder if a board game can do as well at that as a video game can. If it's competing for the same, if it's almost doing what film is doing to, or what it's trying to do what theater tries to do with film. Theater has a very particular function, and it really can't compete with what film and television does. So it shouldn't try. It should try to be what it is, which is a live performance venue with bodies moving in space and speaking to us in real time, as opposed to having 30 scenes as if it were on camera being changed over and we're spending half of our time watching stagehands move furniture. That's not what theater does best. Film can do that like that. In fact, film can even make that more interesting in those transitions and tell more of the story through editing. And I wonder if sometimes board games try to do too much of what video games do very well. So Dungeons and Dragons, again, currently in the fifth edition, the most popular edition probably, at least in terms of how many people it's touched. But before that was the short-lived fourth edition, which many people criticize as being too video gamey. They tried to add too many video game type mechanics and people rejected it because that's not what they were looking for. I imagine that Wizards of the Coast were thinking that this is going to bring us into the new era. It's going to bring all these gamers back to Dungeons and Dragons. But in fact, it alienated many of them by trying to be too much like what a video game does very well. And I think, again, part of the ethos of sitting down to a board game is the social, casual, and often beginner aspect that I've never played this before. Someone show me the rules. And so therefore, if one person or all of us have never played, the stakes are lower. And that allows us to have more fun with it. You know, we always have more fun on the dummy hand than the first time playing cards. And some of us do really well. We thought, oh, I wish that was my real hand, because you stop trying so hard. But it reminds me of something you said a little while ago in this conversation, which was, I was trying to have fun. I was trying to enjoy myself. And I remember thinking, well, that's why you weren't having any fun. You were trying too hard. You were trying so hard to have fun. Anyways, what board games do you play these days that you really enjoy, that tickle these itches, that give you what you want, that are fun for you in that social way, but also in a mechanical way? Yeah.
I've mentioned before to you that I really, really enjoy Seven Wonders. So I enjoy games where, again, it's not clear whether, like, who's winning, so therefore nobody feels like they're totally out of the game, or their choices don't matter. Another thing to touch on here in terms of what can feel really, really bad when people gang up on you is, you know, people can gang up on the person doing the worst, but people can also gang up on the person doing the best. So then again, part of the gaming becomes, don't draw attention to yourself in any way, which is a metagaming thing. And this is, again, it's like, okay, but then it's like, that's not what the game was, you know, it's nothing to do with the way the game was designed. It's really just, don't let people think that you're doing the best, so they don't try to stop you. Don't let people know what you're doing so that they don't try to stop you. I think one of the worst feeling things in a especially a very highly strategic game is where you plan this perfect kind of turn and you have this plan and literally you don't get to make any moves towards it because somebody blocks your idea immediately. But then the next turn they block your next idea immediately. And the next turn, every adaptation you try to make, you get immediately blocked. I think that feeling of just feeling like you're not making progress, right? Feeling like you're not getting anywhere is really frustrating. And I think maybe it's harder for me because I'm a person who wasn't very flexible for a long time. And that's part of what I've worked on, become more flexible. And I can understand that maybe not for a lot of people, you know, that it's such a difficulty to be constantly feeling like you're butting up against a wall. But that was one of the things that was tough. And it was whether I was winning or losing, because if I was truly winning and everyone was ganging up on me, it's like, oh, come on, like I worked really hard to be in this position. But if you're losing, you feel like, why are you picking on the guy who's already losing? Like, let me just try to, you know. And so, you know, it can be really good to have a game like Seven Wonders, where, as I mentioned before, one of the beautiful things I love about it is the fact that everyone takes their turn at the same time, which means that the games, you're not sitting there waiting for other people to take their turn. It also means that when you add players to the game, up to 7 players, it doesn't, the length of time that each game takes or each round takes does not increase with the number of players. You're just always going to be as slow as your one slowest player, but it doesn't matter if you have, you know, 3 players or 7. It's going to be essentially the same length. I really, really thought that was a smart decision. There does feel like there's interaction, even though everyone's taking their turn at the same time, because the game is played by drafting a card from your hand and then passing the cards over. So who you're passing the cards to, and then therefore the choices you're making, matter a lot. And again, it does another thing I think is good in game, which is simple decisions that at the end of the day, all the information provided to you is essentially on the cards for the most part. And you are picking, all you're doing every round is picking a card. Now, how you choose that card, right? That's where the deep strategy is. It's this combination of simple to play. You are just choosing a card from your hand, playing it, and then passing your deck on. And it's just how you make that choice of what card that is the depth of the game. But all of those things, it's pretty short. Rounds are 30 to 45 minutes. Are things that I find are really good for the kind of gaming that I'm into right now. It's very beginner friendly because even though experienced players will often do better, it's easy to get into because mostly you're just reading what the cards say and using them as being that it's more of a, even though it is a board game, but it's a card based board game. All those things are, I think, what makes it one of my favorites so far. You had something to say on Seven Wonders?
Yeah, well, no, I love Seven Wonders. I think it's a wonderful game, and I want to say that you noted an interesting difference again between Euro games and American style games, which is how conflict is handled. So in American style games, usually conflict is direct, and you attack the other person and they attack you, whatever. And in a Euro game, typically conflict is indirect and player interaction is indirect. So there's trade in Settlers of Catan, but you could have an entire game of Settlers of Catan without a single trade occurring. The game is not structured necessarily for that. But I did want to go back to something you said, which is that the games aren't necessarily designed to have everyone gang up on one person, right? That some of them, like Risk, for example, is clearly about player elimination until one player is left. But game like Settlers, there's no elimination. But I think that whether or not it was designed this way, it's absolutely a core feature of this sense of who's on top and interpreting who's on top. You can have a bunch of development cards in Settlers of Catan, and they might be victory points, but they also might be total garbage that don't matter. And you know that person has the longest row, but that person's about to get it, and if they get it, they might win. You're constantly doing this mental gymnastics about who's winning. And I think that a really important part of that is pretending that you're not winning, is bluffing. And it might be really frustrating, and I know it is because my wife hates it when I do this. Like, it's led to real conflict between me and her when I've essentially lied and said, no, I'm not winning. And I think I'm quite good at the bluff over time. I'm quite good at lying low and, having offhand conversations and self-deprecating and like, oh man, what a terrible hand. But it's also a debit on my relationship every time I do that, a debit on my marriage every time I say, oh, this is a terrible hand. Even if it is, it kills her inside. Because if I eventually come out to win, she'll say, what's with all those terrible hands that you had? And so, to me, that is a critical component of playing, the bluff. Not just in poker, but in many board games, because the board game is structured around all of us figuring out who's winning. So Ticket to Ride is a good example. If you play Ticket to Ride with just two people, it doesn't really count because you usually just move around each other and you don't really come into direct conflict that much. But with 4 players at Ticket to Ride, you're constantly blocking each other's path. And if the 3 of us know that you are winning and clearly are ahead, then we're going to say, come on, guys, our role now is to stop her from winning. And if we were to say, well, that's ordained, it's what's going to be, let's just let her win, it's almost not fair. It's like we know what our job is to pull the top person down, which creates almost indirectly a sense of balance in the game. That once one person gets too far ahead, we all bring them back. Whereas in Monopoly, a consistent critique of that game is that once one person is ahead, the other players can't do anything about it. They just suffer the consequences of their reign until the end of the game, hoping maybe that the dice will roll in a certain way to change it. But you have no, again, going back to your statement earlier, you have no agency to change it. In a game like Settlers, your agency is to create an alliance to bring that, even if it's just for one turn, like the classic alliance and Risk, to say, well, we're not going to attack each other over this border for 3 turns, and then someone breaks the alliance. Well, I mean, too bad. I don't know. I actually don't mean that because I would say, okay, you made a deal over here, like a handshake deal. I don't know. That it's an interesting question about that game. Go ahead.
You and Artemis absolutely need to stream or record for an episode or something playing one of these games together. I would watch the hell out of that.
Is he manipulative and a little bastard or what?
I mean, he's good, is what he is. He will make an alliance, and if it's in his best interest to break that, Like, if that's what the correct strategic tactical play would be.
And how do you forgive him for this?
I don't play these games with him. This is the only way. And in fact, I've never played these. Like, it's never even come up because I already knew this about him prior to having to play these kinds of games. So when he says, oh, he really wants to play diplomacy or Axis and Allies or anything, not so much an Axis and Allies in this case, but diplomacy or anything like that, I would just be like, no, I don't need to hate you. I'm good. Thanks. And I think that's an interesting part of, again, what's the purpose, and is it fun? Is it enjoyable? And again, if I was playing with my enemies, if I was truly playing with enemies, I might find that really engaging. But when it's my friends, and this is another thing that's different about video games, online games, you're playing against potentially random strangers. You're being just matched up against people. Sure, no problem. When it's my own friends that I've invited over to my house, those manipulations and lies can run deep.
Have you ever played, it's got many names, the Werewolf or the Mafia, or it was first introduced to me by a woman from Finland who called it the Village, for the village, and, where you're trying to figure out who the person is that's killing everybody in the middle of the night. And it's all about lying and bluffing and making up a story, and you're just trying to find out based on, and usually it's logic goes out the window because we can all create a logic for how someone is doing this who didn't actually do it. And also we all think we're detectives who can detect someone's, lying face, or they look over here when they lie, and we're all terrible at it, right? We all think we're so good and we never get it right. And we convince ourselves of something that isn't true, and a mob rule eventually wins out. I wonder what the statistics would be of how often we actually pick the person who did it or not. But have you ever played, and do you enjoy playing it?
Yeah, I have played quite a few of those games, and I do enjoy them to a point. I think I tried to touch on this before, which is that I'm okay with the games like that when that is what the game is about, right? Is like I know what I'm getting into, that it's the mechanics of the games inherently is to bluff or to, to interact in these ways. Although not necessarily, like, when you are the bad guy, I think the difference in something like diplomacy is there's no person who is the bad guy, right? People are choosing to act in a way that is in their best interest that might really mess somebody else up. As opposed to, I feel like if my friend was handed a card that said you're the killer or you're the werewolf, I can forgive them for lying or for, because that was literally, they didn't choose the role of being the jerk to, that was the goal of the game. Their goal in the game was to win by killing. It was the way that it was written in the rules, and I can play within that and feel really good about it. However, I will say a caveat. I don't always feel like playing those kinds of games because sometimes, that isn't the mood I'm in. But the other thing is that I find if you play those kinds of games too often, especially with the same group, you end up getting into trouble again, where metagaming does evolve and people start behaving particular ways, and you can start picking on people and say, no, I know that when you're acting like this, you're lying. And it starts to therefore it starts to not be fun when you metagame too much and clear strategies become way too strong, and it becomes less like you've played it to death, too easily how to play. It's fun with new people because what's fun about it is you're learning those people. How do they play? How do they act in these situations?
Sure, that makes total sense. When I sit down at any board game table, frankly, any card game table, except for Pandemic or a cooperative game where you're really working towards a common goal together, and there's no other player who's working against you, I honestly sit down with the intent to manipulate and lie and kill or eliminate or whatever I need to do. And I have a great time, and I'm okay losing, and that's just my approach. And I bet you I approach it that way with games that don't require that and aren't designed for that. But because I approach it that way, when someone else does that to me, I'm immediately forgiving. I don't get mad at them. Because I would do the same thing. And often seeing other people play that part of the liar, manipulator, not cheater. We're not talking about cheating here at all, but someone who's what would you call angle shooting in pool, right? So an angle shooter is someone who doesn't take the direct cheat, but they kind of take an angle at it, right? And so when I see people playing these different roles, I want to see my friends do that. I want to see people in a different light. It's almost like going to see a piece of theater, seeing people lie. There are even going back to ancient Greece, the ancient Greek theater, the paragon of art for thousands of years was Greek tragedy for many people. And there were people in Greece at the time who said this is immoral because they're just lying. They're pretending to be something that they are not. And if you just go to basic logic and philosophy, how could lying be good? But it's fun. It's fun to share in it. It's fun to see someone put on a different hat for a while. It's almost like a jester or someone playing the fool, someone who's going to show us the bad thing with a tongue in cheek, knowing that they're playing the bad thing. They're not normally bad, And I take great pleasure in that, and I probably inappropriately apply it to games that it isn't required, And I certainly don't want to hurt anybody's feelings, but that's, I guess, how I was raised in the board game world. And I would never want to, like, if you and I sat down to play a board game and I felt like you were being picked on or something, I would not be happy about that. And I would stop having fun the moment I knew that was happening. I'd probably not want to play anymore. But before that happened, I would probably want to say, hey, so we're all going to lie and cheat. I keep saying cheat. We're all going to lie and manipulate and bluff here, right? Just to almost cover my own ass before I get myself in moral trouble. Yeah.
But you're right. It is all about you're fine with it because you would act that way. And I guess that's what I was saying earlier, that I don't act that way when I'm playing. Like I said, how some DMs will purposefully not attack the same twice. But I try to justify it, right? It's a moralistic thing where I will attack the same person twice if I think that they're winning. And that's the only way to keep the game going. My goal is to keep the game going and keep the game interesting and keep, right? Like I'm at a night, we're having a fun time, try to keep the fun going. And what's fun? Everybody having agency and their choices mattering and the game continuing without it being clear who's winning. Otherwise, then your agency's up. So that's how I play games. I go into it as try to lengthen the game. In that sense, not that I want to have a game that is very, very long in terms of time, but in terms of the experience, like the playing, right? Like and there could be short games that have multiple rounds, and often those games will work well because it's not any one round that matters. Maybe just the playing through them. That's why card games are good, and I mean it's a lot easier because it's often over, and you can do, like you said, you get that round trip of being on top, being on the bottom throughout the night, as opposed to who knows the next time you're going to see these people and play this game with them, whether you'll win or lose. But I do wonder if there's a big connection between your background with theater and also Artemis's. It's very similar how you both share that and act this way. And like I said, I think we need to get a game night going. You need to find a few, if it's not a one-on-one, few other people and play one of these games, because I think that would be a lot of fun.
By the way, I love how you just said, how you guys act this way. It was almost like this abhorrent behavior that you have to witness from time to time. It's I find it really interesting, and it kind of goes to the question of why we play any games. What is fun for each person, right? We can apply it to video games very easily, and how games are designed. Some of them, one game can be designed for multiple kinds of people, but some games are very clear, like this is for you to do this. And I think that you talk about you wanting to lengthen the game. There are some games where that's totally appropriate, like a card game. Lengthening the game means playing again. Let's have another round, right? Let's all want to have another round, but there's two impetuses for that. One, the round I just played was so much fun. But two, I got shellacked so bad, I have to prove that I'm better than that and have another round, right? Which goes probably into gambling a little bit, and why people get addicted to throwing money at this as a problem. Anyways, it's just really interesting how we get hooked into these things and how we play. And I think also this is somewhat related to D&D as well. We need to have different types of personalities in the room. So if it's just me and people like me who are manipulating and lying and always just trying to win at the expense of everyone else's happiness, it's not going to be fun for very long because we don't have a lengthener like you who just wants to keep everyone going. But if it's 5 people like you all lengthening the game, I wonder what that would look like, if it was almost too kind. Like I mentioned my wife before, sometimes she sacrifices her own victory, her own score to be nice to someone. And every time she does it, I said, you did it to yourself. Like, why? Like, she'll play the lesser move because she'll feel bad because I have just said, oh, I got a really bad hand. Oh, I got a really bad hand. And then she'll do something stupid to make me feel better. And I'm like, yeah, do more of that dumb stuff. And then, of course, she feels horrible because she just sacrificed herself for a liar. And it's like we're coming at it from different premises, but the types of people are complementary. I think we all have more fun when we all come together, probably under maybe agreed circumstances or a shared understanding of what's going to go on here. We're like an hour in now. So, Lammy, I'm going to ask you if there was just one thing out of the hundreds that have come up in this really interesting dialogue that you wanted to revisit, or one thing that we haven't talked about that you'd like to talk about in the future, what would that one thing be?
Sounds like I need to play board games with your wife. Because we would get along and we would both be nice people and have a nice, fun evening.
You guys can play the two of you, and Artie and I will just like never want to watch because that would just be horrendous. Go ahead.
But I do think we touched on a very interesting topic today that could definitely be explored. It might actually be deep enough for a couple of different chats. But we talked a little bit about balancing games for beginners versus experienced players. And I think there's a huge meat to talk about there in terms of video games. Because it's a huge struggle for developers with these games, especially multiplayer, like online games. How do they balance what the games feel like for a beginner player versus player? And potentially a slightly different but related topic is how do developers handle endgame content, keeping games fun even after you finished the main, let's say, storyline, or you've reached the max level or whatever.
Yeah, the end game is such a design conundrum, right? Because you want to reward the player who's done the hard work of building up their lead up to that point, but you also want to create the sense that anybody can still win, right? Because honestly, that player who's been in the lead and has done all this stuff and had all the lucky rolls or whatever it is that's put them there, it would feel unfair for them to have it taken away arbitrarily, or at least feel like it was arbitrary. There's actually an interesting economic parallel here that those who have privilege feel oppressed when it's taken away, right? It almost feels unfair, right?
Mario Kart Blue Shell. And you know what? And I agree. We can talk about it, but it does feel unfair. And why does it feel unfair? Because there was no agency. Because the only thing you did wrong was being first, which means that your agency was to not be first. It creates a meta of actually, like you said, pretend you're not winning, pretend you're not, don't be in first, and try to win right at the end, right? And so it becomes a part of the game that wasn't maybe intended in many ways. It's an outcome of trying to balance the game, that there's some opportunity for underdogs to come back, but it doesn't actually make the game feel good when your agency is taken away too. So yeah, I think we could definitely talk about that. And there's a very different version of Endgame for sort of competitive games versus these long-standing online multiplayer games about just content and logging in every day.
Yeah, there was one other thing, and just to quickly bring up, you said it would be really interesting to play a board game that had exploration as its theme and maybe even core mechanic. I don't know how to do that. I'm sure others have tried, but that is interesting. I think the trick with that might be to get those beginners into play something that requires a bit more attention, because exploration requires attention in a way that, picking up a card and throwing it down, 5 plus 4 is 9, is a quick thing that we can do and move on to the conversation. But exploration requires, like Outer Wilds, which we will eventually talk about. I got to think about this as I'm playing. I've got to take notes. I've got to remember, who's this guy playing this instrument. I've got to think about where I've been. I can't just drop in and hit buttons, right? And I think that's maybe the barrier, but hopefully not insurmountable to a board game that would explore exploration. Okay, Lammy, thank you. This was a long one, but I really appreciate it. And next time we'll tackle something along these lines.